So good evening, welcome to the Balie. Almost 7 years ago, at least 85 civilians died because of a Dutch airstrike. The bomb was intended for an ISIS bomb factory in the Iraqi city of Hawija, but the secondary explosion reduced an entire neighborhood to rubble. And tonight we will talk about Hawija and the impact that this horrible incident has had and still has on the people living there today. We will talk about how the Dutch government failed to immediately acknowledge its involvement in the airstrike and how this fitted a pattern in this US-led war against ISIS. We will also talk about what the Dutch government and Ministry of Defense have learned from this event and what they could or perhaps should still learn. My name is Jante Mosselman. I'm a program editor at the Balie, and I will moderate this conversation for you tonight. The first two panels will be in English, and then our last panel will be in Dutch. We have a lot of speakers for you, and I will introduce them, of course, more properly to you a bit onwards in the program. At the end of the program, there will be room for asking questions. My colleague will come towards you with a microphone, please, because this program is live streamed. So if you say something, you might be viewable on the website of the Balie for an eternity. And just so you know that. But please speak into the microphone, because otherwise the people at home who are watching will not be able to hear you. So we're creating this program because a report came out after the strike. It was just published last week. And this report was written by the Iraqi NGO Al-Ghad League for Women and Childcare, the Dutch NGO PAX, and the program Intimacies for Remote Warfare by Utrecht University. The authors of this report will join me in various panels tonight. And the program was created by two of my colleagues, Veronica Baas and Gatul Katawazi of the Balie. Before we're going to head to our first two speakers, I would like to give the floor to Anna Timmerman, General Director of PAX, and she will speak a few words. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Welcome everybody here at the Balie. I really want to thank you that you came here tonight to spend 1.5 hours to listen what happened in 2015 and what happened until today. It's a very important topic, and it's an important topic that we all should care about a lot because it involves our own government. So thank you for coming, for showing that interest. My name is Anna Timmerman. I'm the Executive Director of PAX, which is a peace organization, and we work in about 15 conflict-affected areas around the world. And we always work very closely together with the people in those areas, because our work is really about what those people need or what they want to change in their societies and their communities and how they see improvement in their life. We always talk about what we wanted to achieve as enabling people building peace. And this report is such an example, because we not only work with local activists and local communities, but we also do research and lobby and advocacy so that we can bring the voices and demands of people on the ground to the tables where decisions are being made. I was at a very similar event, similar to this event, just 9 days ago in Erbil, where we presented the report to a mainly Iraqi audience, and where a lot of the victims of Hawija were able to join us. There were members of parliament, of the Iraqi government, of NGOs, representative of different embassies. And so, because we always want to bring back, of course, what we did, the research that we did, to the community that shared their stories, the people who shared their stories. And it was a very intense event because survivors were there. They took the stage, they sat on the stage and shared really, their cries from their hearts about how their life is today and what they need from us. Now, why does an organization like PAX collaborate with the University of Utrecht and an organization like Al-Ghad? And why do we work on such a report, which took almost more than 2 years? We wrote this report because we need to change the narrative. We need to change the narrative about the most precise war in the history of warfare. We need to be talking about civilian harm. We need to know what civilian harm really is. Beyond the number of 70 that were killed or 85, we need to be talking about what the long-term effect is of our so-called precision bombing on communities around the world. That is why we had to write this report. And we did it together with a university because, unfortunately, the stories of victims are most of the time not seen as proof enough. And by collaborating with a university, the stories of the victims became more reliable, hopefully, for members of parliament and for a minister, and much harder to put aside. This is a research that has that stands the test of science, and I think that collaboration is very important. And of course, we work together with Al Raad, which is a local-based organization, because you'll never get these kind of stories if you come from abroad and ask these questions. You have to work with partners that are rooted in the societies, that are trusted by the victims, that speak the language and know the community. I was also able to visit Hawija myself, and I was really moved very deeply to see what this looked like 6.5 years after the bomb fell. Hawija used to be a prosperous community and a real center before the war and before the occupation, a center for agriculture, for little factories, for shops, a place where people would come from around the area. And what you can see today is that still you see a lot of rubble. I was shocked with how little buildings were being rebuilt. Most of it is still, you'll see probably pictures later, it's just rubble. There's nothing there, as if it happened maybe a year ago. But more striking, I think, is not the destruction of the buildings, but the destruction of the society. And of course, that's very influenced as well by the occupation by ISIS, but also very much about the effects of this bomb. Because people have not been able to rebuild their lives because there are no livelihoods. They don't have money to rebuild the shop that was lost, or to find jobs, or send their kids to school. Also, meeting the people, it was very clear that they had a huge lack of access to medical needs. People showed their injuries, and I'm not a doctor, but I really much had the idea that if they would be able to have access to the kind of medical help that we have here, that some of the injuries they might get some form of relief. What was also very clear was the trauma that they have been gone through, and that there was no help to deal with the trauma, and that there was no psychosocial support. There was also very little community healing, which is so important in a community like the Hawija. Now, what can we do? Sitting here, you all care, so you're here, so what can we do? I think that it all starts with the fact that we have a very vibrant community in Hawija that is active and wants to stand up for their rights. They want us to hear what is going on, and they want us to amplify their voices. This research is part of an important step, I think, to make their voices heard. But there's also, for instance, the documentary made by Danny Goosen, which reached a lot of people in the Netherlands and gave much more knowledge to what happened in Hawija. There's the court case done by the lawyer Lisbeth Zegveld, who is here as well. And all those things will help to create more pressure on members of parliament, also here, to ask questions from the minister, and hopefully create a situation in which it's also very interesting for this relatively new Minister of Defense to take the lead internationally on how we deal with civilian harm in these kind of wars. And I think that what we also can do for after today, which all of you can be part of, is to amplify the voices of the victims very literally in the demands that they have. Their two main important demands are they want an apology from the Dutch government, and they want individual compensation. And they say if we don't get it, we'll go to court. And I think that's the first thing we can do, to repeat and repeat and repeat again those two demands of the people in Hawija, to get compensation and to get an apology, because I think that that's where the healing can start. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Timmerman. I'm joined here by Azmat Khan, an award-winning investigative journalist writing for the New York Times, a Carnegie Fellow and an assistant professor of journalism at Columbia University, and she was reporting on Hawija. And Laren Gould, assistant professor in conflict studies at Utrecht University and one of the co-authors of the Hawija report. We're going to talk a bit about the international context of the airstrike and about the type of warfare that was conducted, the secrecy that surrounded the civilian casualties and that type of warfare caused. So, Lauren, I want to start with you. Can you tell me, first of all, when and why this US-led coalition was formed? How did this start?
Yeah, so it really started when IS took over a lot of territory across Syria and Iraq. 2014, mm-hmm. Yeah. And Obama, they just killed an American journalist, and Obama said, right, there's no way to deal with this evil except for military action, mm-hmm. And started to build a coalition. And this coalition existed of the US, so the US led the coalition, but they formed alliances with, among others, the UK, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, mm-hmm. Australia, a lot of Western advanced militaries. And what was interesting and what intrigued us about this particular operation is that it was a military intervention that was characterized by its remoteness. So instead of like sending boots to the ground, mm-hmm. like we saw previously, of course, in Iraq
and in Afghanistan,
before, and in Afghanistan, this war was fought, verticality, right from the air, mm-hmm. dropping over now, we know 35,000 missions, over more than 100,000 bombs, but also through partnershiping with local partners. So the Iraqi military, Kurdish Peshmerga, many different militias across Syria, to really do the fighting and the dying and the battlefield against mm-hmm. IS. And this was one of the reasons why we at Utrecht University, at the Intimacies of Remote Warfare program, was following this operation, mm-hmm. looking at how it was legitimized, how it was carried out, mm-hmm. and ultimately also the impact on the ground. As conflict analysts, we're interested in, okay.
Of course, yeah. And do you remember your initial thought when they said it was going to be a remote war, a war from the air? What do you think?
Well, I think what intrigued me most, it wasn't announced that it was going to be a remote war. It was mm-hmm. mostly announced that this was the most precise war in history. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of emphasis in the legitimization of this particular operation that we investigated together with Jolle Demmers, who's here today, mm-hmm. at length. The language used to legitimize. So a lot of emphasis was placed on the technologies. We have these precise bombs, and that this was the most precise war in history, but mm-hmm. also that zero civilian casualties were the highest priority, and protecting the civilians on the ground. Mm-hmm. So after having studying this, we also increasingly saw that NGOs such as PAX, but also Amnesty International, Airwars is a very well-known one, were investigating, and investigative journalists, mm-hmm. extremely important, the impact on the ground, and yes. they were coming up with a very different reality, mm-hmm. that this was indeed, as Anna illustrated for this case, but across these 35,000 strikes, that actually a lot of civilian casualties were taking place, mm-hmm. and that ultimately whole cities were being destroyed by these coalition airstrikes. And so that's why we started to become interested in, okay, well, what is the actual impact? Mm-hmm. And also then again, looking at when these civilian casualties are brought to the public, mm-hmm. how do the advanced militaries involved actually respond to them? So do they acknowledge them? Do they count them? Or is it a question of trying to keep them secret or
Yes.
deny, and so then that's why we started to study this operation at length, because it had all the different dimensions of kind of contemporary warfare that we were intrigued with.
Yeah. Thank you. Was this the way that this war was also communicated to the American public in the first, that it was going to be the most precise war?
Yes, that had been the approach that the United States had been taking for years in talking about this shift from putting troops on the ground and to transitioning under the Obama administration many of America's existing wars to those fought by air. And I just want to say what an honor it actually is to be here because of the ethos, because of the climate here in the Netherlands, that really so many people care about this issue and followed this war in comparison with what you might see in the United States. And I also just want to say that as a journalist, I think journalists are often bothered when they have competition on their beat. And I was very sad that I didn't have much competition in this reporting. And it was such an honor, with the exception of Dutch journalists, who were all over this in a way that just, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I feel in very good company. I started investigating this in early 2016. And so 6 years ago. And actually the very first pitch that I wrote up for an editor actually began with Hawija. And in that pitch, it started with, an airstrike on a hospital, probably conducted by the Iraqi Air Force in an area called Sherkat. And all of the patients in that hospital were moved to hospitals in Hawija. And about a month later, there was an airstrike on a maternity ward in Hawija. And I just remember being so struck by the images that came out at the time. 8 of the 18 people killed in that airstrike were newborns. And, photos taken by locals showed the body of a baby coated in gray dust, still bandaged where her umbilical cord had been, and strewn amidst the rubble were packets of formula and baby bottles. And I can say this because I wrote this into that pitch, and I said the next year in Hawija, there was an airstrike so large that locals reported as many as 70 people were killed. They described it as like an earthquake. Mm-hmm. And to me, this was one of the most defining moments of that war to date, and yet the American media was not that interested. And to see the ways in which this particular airstrike has prompted widespread attention here in the Netherlands, lots of concern from many parliamentarians, is just, it means a lot. And I want to reflect how different that is from, the experience that many Americans have and how unique that is in this war. I also just want to take a moment to just briefly step out and let you know that this one incident, which killed as many as 70 people, killed many people and had all different other kinds of effects as described in the report, that go beyond death and injury and impacts on the lives of people, that there were so many other airstrikes in Hawija and across Iraq and Syria that resulted in civilian deaths. And I think the first time that I was able to speak to survivors from Hawija was they had just recently left. They had fled from it in October of 2016, and I met them in a refugee camp, and people were describing being IDPs, displaced, and not having a place to live, and now being on the run, and then treated as criminals, because people from Hawija have often been treated that way in Iraq due to a complicated history. And they described airstrikes on restaurants, ice cream shops, all different kinds of places that took an enormous civilian toll.
This does not sound like a very precise war, the way you describe it.
I think when you go on the ground and you start talking to people, it becomes very apparent that it was widely at odds from what we'd been told. And so the first time I was able to get into Hawija was January of 2018, shortly after it had been liberated. And it was a ghost town, so much so that there wasn't even a stray cat or dog. And I was seeing this across Iraq. So I think the first big project I did into this looked at a sample of 100 airstrikes in Iraq in 3 different areas. It was published in late 2017. And, what I found was so at odds with what we'd been told. And this is just back then, and much has happened since, but just to give you a brief overview. I looked at strikes that had both, I went door to door in 3 different areas of northern Iraq. And what I found was that I was looking at strikes that resulted in civilian deaths and injuries and those that didn't. And 1 in 5 airstrikes, 1 in 5 out of these more than 34,000 was resulting in a civilian death. And that's a rate that was 31 times higher than what the US-led coalition was claiming. So we know that these numbers, if you run that as a statistical inference, you're coming up with numbers that are even higher than what civil society organizations that catalog these online are finding. So the toll is much higher, but then the reasons for why they're happening are also varied and complex, and I can walk you through, what my latest reporting, has shown, which really, I think, doesn't just call into question these numbers, but also the kind of confidence about what's going wrong and why. The US military and many of its allies have often told populations of their governments that this is not just incredibly precise, but that the intelligence is also very precise. Now, you can hit the target exactly as you would like to hit perfectly and have physical precision. But if your intelligence is incorrect, or if you're not studying problems or trying to evaluate lessons learned, suddenly that precision, the ability to hit a target perfectly, no longer matters. And that's been the basis of my most recent work.
So there's a lack of intelligence, you would say, in what we can know when we go to war.
Yes. So specifically, I and many other civilian casualty, people who look at civilian casualties often categorize this as misidentification, when there is certain kinds of intelligence that indicates, that this is an ISIS headquarters, but it is in fact actually a house. Now, I spent much of the last several years in a legal battle with the U.S. Department of Defense to obtain all of these different assessments that the U.S. military and other militaries involved in this campaign claim to do as a means of accountability, to show that they're precise. Because the big challenge for me in my work on the ground had often been the fact that I can say I found these particular things on the ground, or these people told me this, and the response I often get is that you don't have the intelligence that we do, and it's classified and you can't have it. And so I spent years suing the Department of Defense and U.S. Central Command for these records. And what I was able to do was analyze what they showed and then compare them to a sizable sample of my reporting on the ground to see what do they say in these records versus what actually happened. Now, misidentification only came up in 4% of the cases and admitted civilian casualty incidents in those records. But at the sites I visited on the ground, it was a major factor in 17% of incidents, but accounted for nearly a third of civilian deaths and injuries. So incidents like, that have large death tolls, for example, like Hawija, misidentification played a major role. Like nearly a third of all of the casualties I documented on the ground were attributable to the belief. It can be different kinds of misidentification, either, for example, like in Kabul, you have now placed, a civilian car as an enemy car, that would be misidentifying it, but there's also, due to confirmation bias, seeing a threat where there isn't. But there's also a kind of misidentification that can be misassociation. So they might hit something on a particular street, believing it to be an ISIS bed-down location, but actually, it's not just that it's wrong, but there was a legitimate ISIS bed-down location just further down the street, and there was that misassociation. Another major reason for why civilian casualties occurred was failing to detect the presence of civilians in these places. So oftentimes they would go through their process, right? This incredible process that they've developed and conclude, well, there are no civilians in this area. So it's a go. And they were routinely missing the presence of civilians. So in a fifth of the cases in the Pentagon documents, they failed to detect the presence of civilians, but it actually accounted for 37% of credible cases and nearly 3/4 of total civilian deaths in the ground sample. So 3/4 occurred because they did not detect the presence of civilians. And that raises serious questions about intelligence. Another major factor were secondary explosions, which is what took place here in Hawija.
Yep.
So among the sites I visited on the ground, at least half of the strikes with secondary explosions involved targets in which it could be anticipated that there might be large amounts of secondary explosions. So, for example, with Hawija, if you are going to be bombing a car bombing factory, you can anticipate that there will be large secondary explosions. And so that certainly, I think, aligns with what you've seen in the PAX report and some of the recommendations that they have made in terms of the need to really be realistic about secondary explosions. And then I won't get into each breakdown right now, but there were a number of other factors, including overlooking flawed intelligence. So at times in these documents, they would state, there would be somebody who actually said, we don't have sufficient intelligence to conduct this airstrike, and it would still be carried out. Or there would be flawed video, not just in terms of quantity, like seconds of video taken, or collateral scans taken, or vetting, but also quality. So there were many times in which, we are told that this video imagery, this drone imagery is so precise, when in fact at times they were unable to distinguish between, a man carrying a heavy object, dragging a heavy object into a building, which then later upon, really projecting that video upon a larger screen, they determined that heavy object being dragged was in fact, had the appearance of a small child. And, things like that were occurring again and again. It's not just what we're told. We're often told the kind of projection that the military has made is that a lot of these casualties occur because somebody walked into the target frame and there was a legitimate target hit. But the actual reasons for this are much wider and more varied. And none of these governments, based on the reporting I've done, the embed that I did in Qatar with many of these coalition countries where they're operating, but more significantly in my reporting on the ground and this large cache of documents, more than 5,400 pages, it really shows that they're not studying these and trying to learn lessons from them and implementing changes based on those lessons.
We'll get back to that later on as well. Thank you very much. Lauren, I want to speak with you a bit about the Dutch intelligence and the intelligence that the Dutch government had. Can you tell me about that?
Well, yes, it's not something that we studied at length for the report, so I'm hoping Azmat will also back me up on this. What we know, so the reality of coalition warfare is that different members of the coalition have different roles within these targeting processes. For this particular strike, we know that the intelligence that Azmat was just referring to was coming from the US. So they did the gathering of the intelligence on this specific strike.
Dutch did none of that themselves?
They didn't do it themselves, no. What we know from the CENTCOM report that indeed we only got access to after a Freedom of Information Act submitted by Azmat, is that actually there were warnings by the people involved saying it's unlikely that this wouldn't have a large secondary explosion and it's unlikely that civilians would not be affected. But still, there was a great eagerness, and this is something we discussed over dinner just before we came here, for the strike to take place, and also for what they call a collateral damage estimate to be, to equal zero. Basically, they do the calculations, and zero civilian casualties have to come out. Especially at that time, it was still that no civilian casualties were allowed to be coming out of that estimate before a target would be struck. This estimation then goes to the red card holder. This is a Dutch military personnel with a legal background who then gives the yay, okay on a strike or says, no, we're not going to strike. So there is lots of questions, I suppose, we have about this process. So it's said, and this is also done, was researched by the investigative journalists at the NRC and NOS, that the red card holder didn't have these warning signals that the US had, intelligence personnel had put on the table. But then there's always the question of, this is a bomb factory in the middle of a city, it's not hard to kind of make the conclusion that there would be civilians around and this could have a large impact. So there's questions that arise. And Azmat also, I think I'd love you to pick up on this, was this question of why the Netherlands was also so eager to bomb this particular strike. And
Yes, I mean, if you look at the document, which is 70 pages for this incident, it's much longer than most of the ones I have. A full investigation was done. This wasn't just an assessment. You can see the interviews with people who were involved in the weaponeering around this strike who get quite candid. And so I'm just going to read a quick quote from it, from somebody who was involved in doing the intelligence for the strike. My targeteers actually spent hours working and reworking this target just to make that collateral damage estimate executable, which means that they had to get to a rate of 0 in terms of the civilian casualty estimate. And he goes on to say, I remember thinking it seemed a bit foolish to re-weaponeer the structure with a redacted, it's likely the weapon, with a redacted, which are not the right tool for the job. All of this work was to achieve a, quote, redacted, probably a civilian casualty estimate of 0, when there were several collateral objects in close proximity to the target, and the target was a VB IED facility, a car bomb factory. In the meantime, I do not think it was a reasonable assumption to think that there would not be any collateral damage based on the knowledge that this was a car bomb factory with collateral structures so close to this strike. And it was another officer who basically had said, we were being pressured to come out with a rate of 0 and to also give, to completely destroy this target, to really eradicate what was believed to be, what was a car bomb factory. And they said that there was a lot of pressure to turn this over quickly and to get that to 0, meaning that this was being done so the Dutch could carry it out. And so the question that I have grappled with, and I think Dutch journalists and investigators would be far more apt to answer, is why were they so eager to carry that out? Why were they rushing this process? It's out there that others had perhaps turned down carrying this out. There are often strikes that are, far less likely to cause civilian harm, where you don't have to work to get to a 0, for example, a particular kind of a weapons depot or whatever it might be. There are other targets. So to work so hard to carry this out raises lots of questions about why did they want to strike this IED facility so badly? Does it have to do with weapons that were recently purchased? Does it have to do with, what it means to strike an IED factory? I don't know the answer, but I think it's incredibly worthy of investigation because this did not have to happen based on that document, if you read it.
Lauren?
I think it's a really good point and something that we need to pick up on. And I think you're mentioning the type of bombs that were used. So I was looking in my report to see if we have mentioned it, but I don't want to quote it. So here comes my lack of technology. But it's a thank you. See, this is why we need these partnerships, so we can't do it on our own. GBU 39 were recently bought by the Netherlands, and therefore, we see often that once these kind of technologies and military attire are bought, there's a willingness and an eagerness to also use them. So this might be part of the answer to this question, but that, again, this is not something we've investigated. So these are assumptions that we've just discussed over dinner.
But it's an interesting,
and I would
But you can read in the document, you have somebody saying, whatever this was, it wasn't the right tool for the job, which is really, I think, very important to investigate what that was.
There's two more things I want to go to before we're going to Jolle Demmers. And the first thing is, when do you think that Western political leaders who were carrying out this coalition became aware that this was not a precise war? And did they act on that?
So this is an excellent question. I think that it's hard to say with individual officers who are doing these assessments and carrying them out because they're following a process that they're told to follow, right, in which they're fulfilling these boxes. And the process itself is it functions in a way where it's very routine for them not to detect the presence of civilians. It's very routine for them not to overly rely on video in the investigations after the fact or assessments after the fact, which, as I mentioned, can be quite flawed, not just in terms of quality, but in terms of quantity. So the system functions in a way in which, many of these officers may not be aware. But, it's very clear to me that those involved who see what this is, that they may also suffer from confirmation bias, in which they might see people in the rubble, but they might believe them to be ISIS, right? Because they've now seen this as a target. There are many examples from my reporting in which I obtained documents where they saw children, right? And rather than reevaluating what that target was, in one case they saw 3 children on a roof of what they believed to be an ISIS bed down location, a place where ISIS fighters slept. And rather than reevaluating it and realizing that they had the wrong target, but there had been an ISIS bed down location across the street, they now determined that that target was an ISIS weapons manufacturing facility. And they carried it out, and they said that this more pernicious threat was proportional to the military advantage gained by eradicating that weapons factory, so it was okay, or it was proportional if those 3 children might die. And so, it's certainly the case that there is a lot to uncover about this, and there's a lot about the system and structure that they may not, it's built so that you don't necessarily see these people. It's not that it's built this way, but it's often the case that they do not see these people as civilians in many of these cases, or they see it as worth the risk because they see a target as a target. At the same time, there's been reporting that has shown that people were very aware. Certain task forces involved in special operations, airstrikes, that they were familiar with that, and it was seen as necessary in this war. And so, I really want to be careful about, I don't have evidence to show that individual officers doing these assessments believe that they were writing up wrong reports. But at the same time, you do have to ask, why is it built in this way in which they're strategically, not just undercounting, but not understanding why these are occurring? And how damning is it that they're not truly investigating? Why did a journalist have to obtain these records and study them to see what the lessons learned are?
And not the military or the government itself.
It's not my job, or at least it shouldn't be.
Yeah, and one of the things I picked up, I was listening to your podcast yesterday in preparation, but what you also said that, what I found really interesting, so you have the legitimizing discourse to the broader public about these wars, but there's also what you said, Azmat, is these procedures in themselves are also legitimizing internally within the military institution, right? Because there's all these different people playing these important roles in this procedure that maybe don't necessarily see the bigger picture, but do feel like they're being accountable, or, towards their actions. And that in itself can then also legitimize their own role. So that's part of, I think, the answer. But I think the other part is, do people know? Of course they do. I mean, our then Minister of Defense was immediately warned by the F-16 pilots that a whole neighborhood had been destroyed. She received a couple of weeks later the CENTCOM report, at that time classified, stating that the civilian casualties, the 70 reported by local organizations and Reuters, that they were credible. So yes,
they knew,
yes. and they then denied questions of civilian harm caused by Dutch military action, and then kept secret. This is just one incident there, but we're talking also about this. Like I said, this coalition destroyed 80% of Raqqa, 70% of Mosul. There is no way that you don't know about the harm.
Civilians died.
Civilians die, but also the long infrastructures.
Completely gone, of course.
So there's, we now, we now see the images every day about what's happening in Ukraine. And we have investigators there. showing us the destruction that's taking place. We also, as a public now, it suddenly is very close to home and on our screens every day. That is also the level of damage that happened in Iraq and Syria. We just didn't see it.
Yes.
But it is there, and it was seen by very important people that were engaging in these military actions.
I have a last question for you both. Short yes or no. Do you think it's possible to have a precise war or a clean war? Is that something that...
Well, I think that's something people need to be honest about, right? So the myth, I know you said yes or no, but let me take this moment.
But do you think it could be? Do you think it's a possibility? Is that possible, that kind of war?
No, a perfectly clean, sanitized war in an urban environment? Absolutely not. But why are we selling, or why are governments portraying it to be that way? I mean, there's also something to be said about the focus on, reducing civilian harm, which then often goes on to legitimize wars. But you have to step back and you have to ask whether or not that's truly realistic. And it's something that should be, in democracies, the subject of debate and informed consent. But most citizens of the countries that are doing this bombing are not informed about what's being done in their name and the realities of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think the only thing I can add to that, because I agree with everything that you said, is the problem with that is because this is done remotely, and we no longer have returning body bags, military body bags, we no longer feel the consequences of war ourselves. So this combination of no longer having this, heated political debate of why are we going to war, why are our men and women being sent to war, that's no longer the case. And we're very badly informed about the consequences for those on the receiving end of our military action. That combination makes it hard to care, but it doesn't make it any less pertinent and important to care, because I think we'll get to that in the next sessions, is, the destruction that we cause. This operation was legitimized by defeating IS. So the main aim of the game was to defeat IS and bring enduring security. We were in Hawija last week. You can really question whether this is, an enduring security situation. People cannot meet their basic needs. They have really strongly felt grievances and disappointment, which is absolutely understandable. And they're grappling to reintegrate former IS families. These, as a conflict analyst, these are the core factors that play into new cycles of violence. And I think that, as a Western public, we have to care for that reason, because that's also our security in the long run. So,
and it doesn't solve the reasons why we went to war in the first place.
I don't think, not in the long run.
Yeah. Okay, thank you both very, very much for being here. I would like to ask Jolle Demmers, Professor in Conflict Studies at the University of Utrecht and research leader of the Intimacies of Remote Warfare program and co-author of the report, to come forward and briefly introduce us to what happened exactly on that night, June 7 years ago. And I would like to ask the next panel to come and sit with me quietly already while this is happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Azmat and Lauren already masterfully talked us through the larger picture of the US-led war against ISIS and the politics of not knowing and the secrecy surrounding this type of remote warfare. But let us now take you to Hawija, to the night of the bombing and its aftermath. On the night of 2 to 3 June 2015, 2 Dutch F-16s targeted an ISIS ammunition factory located in the industrial neighborhood in Hawija. And as you already heard, the airstrike caused a large secondary explosion, which then resulted in the destruction of a major share of the neighborhood and led to severe civilian harm. Now, the airstrike on Hawija is only one out of 34,000 strikes.
that the US-led coalition against ISIS was engaged in between 2014 and 2018, dropping over 100,000 bombs. And these are the numbers. And as much as we emphasize the importance of numbers in our report, they do not tell a story. They don't really help us to understand. This is what this report, I think, on the Hawija airstrike is really about. It's first and foremost an attempt to understand the impact of the strike on the lives and on the livelihoods and futures of the people in Hawija. Now, in the media, over the past days, a lot of attention was paid to how our findings show that it are not 70, but 85 civilians who lost their lives as a result of the bombing. And this is an important new fact that needs recognition. But what we show in this report is that casualty numbers, although important, are only part of the issue. More than anything, the report tells the story of those who survived, of those who still live among the dead. And it confronts us with the long-term layers of civilian harm in Hawija and the ways these reinforce and exacerbate each other, and also how they're given meaning. And with this, it reveals and it makes visible at least parts of a history of violence that has been often rendered unknowable. A history of violence that we are all part of, and that connects us. So this documentation stands. The key question now is whether it will be seen and whether it will be read and whether the devastation and suffering will be recognized. And that is a question, but above all, a practice that concerns us all. So thank you, and on to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Professor Demmers. I'm joined here by Saba Azim, co-author of the Hawija report and project leader at PAX, Lisbeth Zegveld, a human rights lawyer representing 11 victims from Hawija, and Danny Goosen, documentary maker. Thank you all for being here. Before we're going to go to the findings of the report, I'd quite like us to watch a bit of your documentary, Danny Goosen. Als de bom valt, when the bomb strikes. Let's just look at a clip from it. Yeah, it's always very harsh, I think, how you can speak about 100,000 bombs, and then when you see one father mourning its children, it always feels really different, I think. Danny Goosen, can you tell me about this father? How did you meet him?
We met him through the organization in Iraq, and he was actually very sad, and he said, "Oh, another journalist coming over to film us or to, talk to us. I mean, I really don't want to talk to you guys." But I spoke to him, and I convinced him that he should tell his story because we are from the Dutch television, and I think that the Dutch people should hear his story because he told us his story, and it was really heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. So I managed to convince him that his story is very important, and that he's like one of many people. But I mean, losing 6 children and his wife, I mean, that's it's very, very hard, and also for him. But he was very disappointed, and actually in the beginning he just didn't see any chance of talking to us because he said, like, I told my story many times and nothing's happening, so why should I do it again? But I'm very glad that he did, so that the people he can see what happened to him and to his family.
How many fathers like him have you met, do you think?
Oh, everybody wanted to talk to us. Everybody in Hawija, like they had a story, or they were injured, or they lost somebody, or they lost their house, or their car, or their job, or their factory. So it was really like, I'm sorry, I have to go now. I cannot talk to you. I'll talk to you later, or I'll give me your number. It, like, especially the first day when we got there, it was I mean, I was in Iraq before, in Mosul in 2019, and I spoke to many people, but this was like, it was overwhelming for everybody, and I think for my crew as well, because it was so in your face, and they were angry, not at us, of course, but of what happened, and of course that the Dutch government never showed up there, and actually never gave a sign of caring, or at least, or even saying sorry to the people over there, because they're looking for somebody to talk to, and I think that they thought, well, these are Dutch people, let's talk to them.
And how can you say something about how big the impact was of this airstrike, you think, on the communities there?
Well, I mean, this was like last year, 2021, December. So I don't think that we saw actually the whole impact of what the bomb did to Hawija. But of course, the scars the people had and the people are still carrying with them are there. But let me say something. This guy is not from Hawija. He's from Tikrit. So, sorry?
Al-Bouajil.
Yeah, so he was actually caught there. ISIS wouldn't let him leave. So there are many people who are actually not from Hawija. And if this guy died or his whole family was wiped out, I don't know if we would even have known that this whole family died, because there are many other refugees who were in Hawija, because we spoke to many people, and there were many people that we didn't know. They were trapped in Hawija. So I don't know where they are. We don't know how many people are actually gone, destroyed by the bomb. You know, we couldn't. When we were walking there in the rubble, my colleague and I, we found bones. I think they were human bones still. So, you know, it's not only the people from Hawija, but there were also a lot of people actually caught in Hawija and couldn't go nowhere because ISIS wouldn't let anybody leave.
Already on refuge.
Sorry?
They were already refugees there.
Yeah, in their own country, yeah.
Thank you. Saba, I want to talk, because you, in this report, you looked at harm. And what I find very interesting is that you made a different definition of harm. Can you tell me something about that?
I think before I start on the harm, I just want to show these were the 7 people. So we see the 85 people, and that's the tip of the iceberg that everybody around here is discussing, but these are actual human faces behind it. And when I met with Abdullah back in September, he actually asked to publish these faces and actually ask the Dutch public and the Dutch government if these 5 children and 2 wives, the youngest one being 9 months, if they look like terrorists to anybody. So harm for us is not the 85 people only. No. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So for us, again, we've only interviewed 119 civilians, and our research was only in Hawija. So not the internally displaced persons that Danny just discussed, and a lot of them came from Balie, from Salahuddin, because Hawija strategically was a point where people from Salahuddin and from Mosul were coming and then going off to safer areas, paying smugglers an average of $400 per person to escape. Not everybody could afford that. So those who stayed behind were then labeled as ISIS sympathizers and so on, something that Azmat already talked about, the complex history of Hawija. So for us, it's also the personal property that was damaged. If you really want to give numbers, then there's 6,000 houses and buildings which were damaged, although the battle damage assessment that the CENTCOM later released only talks about 700, so to speak. Again, that's only an aerial shot. Nobody has really gone on the ground so far. Extremely disappointing. 20 car dealerships, 5 ice factories, 1 flour mill, 1 textile mill, an electricity substation, 3 brick factories, the municipality department, the civil defense department, and 12 of their vehicles, which provide emergency medical services, firefighting, and so on. So that's wiped out. There was a fuel station, 1,200 shops estimated, the sewage department building, the Sunni endowment building, the veterinary services department, 15 schools, out of which 6 were completely destroyed. And 1,900 persons are unemployed. And Hawija also used to be an agricultural hub, which meant that they're making seeds and saplings for the rest of Iraq to therefore use for their agricultural purposes. Previously, they would generate about 1.2 saplings, which are now down to 200,000. So the reverberations are also for the rest of the country. Nobody wants to talk about that. So far, it's been fixated on 70 persons, which we know is also a vast understatement of what those numbers were really.
One of the things that I read that was particularly horrible is that for these people who were wounded, there was no way to get to the hospital as well.
No, so that's the other thing. You know, Lauren and Azmat talked great lengths about intelligence, or rather lack thereof, and also the cultural sensitivity, I would assume. I was also in Iraq during the war against ISIS, so that's basic logic. That when an area is besieged by ISIS, everything from the municipality to basic services like schools, like hospitals are under ISIS control. And if civilians had not pledged allegiance to ISIS, they were denied treatment. So this is exactly what happened in Hawija General Hospital. It was under ISIS control, and a lot of civilians were therefore denied treatment unless they pledged allegiance. There's this one lady who we spoke to last week again, and she said that when she was taking her family to Mosul General Hospital, because it's 150 kilometers away, so they could still ISIS territory, so they were able to move. ISIS soldiers actually told her to get out of the car and kiss her feet, so they would allow her to go there. Yeah. So this is the sort of things that they had to suffer from. They ended up at pharmacists or so-called doctors in the outskirts who stitched them up without using anesthesia.
Yeah. But we must also not forget that ISIS would not let people go to the hospitals so that they will die, and then they say, "This is what the coalition did to you." So exactly. ISIS had also a part in this whole thing. They wanted as many dead so that they can say, "This is what they're doing to you. Yeah. We're the good guys. They're bombing you." Yeah. And it's not, ISIS. So it's a complicated situation.
They were giving out compensation, I heard as well.
Yes.
So ISIS would compensate within 72 hours who they thought was innocent if they died as a result of ISIS action. And this was depending on the case between $200 and $700. So the question we were asked is, how is a terrorist entity more human than the Netherlands, which claims to be a champion of human rights? And then followed by, if the Netherlands is a champion of human rights, then do Dutch lives matter more than Iraqi lives?
ISIS would also make a propaganda movie about it and go out on the street giving people money, and everybody would kiss their hands and, "Oh, you're such a good guy." And they would, because they have to, otherwise they'll kill you. And then they'll post it online and say, "We're the good guys," Yeah.
Lisbeth, you represent 11 victims from Hawija. I was wondering, what strikes you the most in this case? Because you've done so many human rights cases.
Well, I would first like to thank PAX and University of Utrecht and all those already involved in this case for their work. It sets this case apart that we already have so many facts available on which we can work. We can never do the work as lawyers if we don't have these facts. The documentaries are being made and reports being available. Just look at the Indonesian case. When we finished, the report started being written. So that's important for us. Well, let me also say from the beginning that there are 11 persons on the writ of summons that we filed with the state in February. But we intend to represent as many people as we can collect the documents of. That will be very difficult to get everything in place for all these people. What have you lost? They have no paperwork that can prove their losses. Maybe they can't even prove that they have lost family members. And the court system, it's not about pity, it's not about being credible, it's just about hard evidence. So people that lack the evidence, and that's something it is not identifying this particular case, it's the same in Afghanistan, it was the same in Indonesia, that we need such evidence. what we're now doing is starting with the bit that was in the first panel, trying to get the court convinced that what was done was wrongful, that it was disproportional, and that provisional measures should have been taken, like evacuating the civilian population. If you want to bomb that factory, just take the city out. Well, they couldn't, of course, because they didn't have boots on the ground. They didn't have, well, then don't do it. So it was disproportionate in terms of military advantage compared to human cost. That's one part of the claim. The second part is that we failed, of course, bluntly in our duty to investigate the case. That's a very clear and important aspect in all these cases. So at the end of my story, I will say much of the cases are similar. You have to investigate. If you kill people, even if it's not your fault or you're not liable for it, even if you don't have to pay compensation, you still have a duty to investigate. If you don't, you're liable to pay compensation even for that duty to, failing the duty to investigate. So that's a very important part, because the right to life doesn't mean anything. Civilian protection doesn't mean anything if no one looks into it. So maybe, but again, Afghanistan, we're doing cases back in 2007. This case was, it was much more recent. So that's where we currently are, and we have cut the case into two bits. First, the wrongful part, and when we win that part, for these 11, just to make it easier for us not to have to present all the evidence at once, and making it easy for the state to say, well, you can't prove this, you can't prove that. We will then enter into a settlement procedure and try to prove as many cases as we can, with the help of PACs who have all these cases, well, not ready perhaps, but kind of prepared.
But if I may also say that what Lisbeth said, that the failure to investigate, and that's the frustration that we all felt jointly, and this was the product of that frustration, basically.
Yeah. It's we're asking for. Maybe it's interesting to speak a little bit about the question whether you should go for collective damages or for individual damages. We rarely go for collective damages in these cases because we easily enter into a conflict of interest with the community, like the mayor representing the community, Hawija, the province. What do we have? When I discussed this with representatives of the people in Hawija, and I said, listen, there's much more damage caused here than individuals having lost family members, having injuries, having lost their houses. There's a community interest here as well. And they made it very clear to me that they have no trust in the local community, that any collective damage being paid out to the local community will be lost, at least to them. And so they want all our clients over the last 20 years, they want to have the assurance that they get something for themselves so they can rebuild their own lives. Apart from this, people, not all of them are still in Hawija. We just discussed this. There are internally displaced people, refugees. What do we have? They left Hawija. So collective damages that benefit Hawija won't benefit them. So these are various reasons not to go for a collective claim, though there is definitely an aspect to it. It's definitely important. And the 4.1 million of the Dutch government is not compensation. It's not because there is accountability. It's a humanitarian gesture, like, oh yeah, we're here to help you. But it doesn't match to the accountability that we want to prove. So it's violation of a rule and a duty to pay, either individually or collectively.
Before we're going to go, we're going to look at two more video clips. And I want to ask for the second one. It is another part of Danny Goosen's documentary. I wanted to look at this video before we start talking about compensation, because what one of the men, of course, says in the video is there's no way to compensate that. So I find it very important to stress
True.
that.
Yeah.
Saba, but can you tell us what did the Dutch government do in terms of compensation to the victims?
So in December 2020, the Dutch Parliament announced about 4.4 million euros, again, out of, like Lisbeth said, out of the goodness of their hearts for communal rehabilitation, so to speak. This was awarded to two UN agencies, UNDP and IOM. There were no consultations with the authorities on the ground. So the mayor, the Mukhtar, the community representatives, they were never compensated, what the projects should look like, how they should be compensated, and so on. In an update to Parliament in November of last year, it said that the projects had already started. During my visit in November, then February, I saw very nice billboards with the UNDP and the Dutch flag claiming a rehabilitation project with nothing behind the billboards. In April, the billboards were taken down, so I don't know where they went. I've spoken to the electricity department, so there is some movement happening with the UNDP money, because they were supposed to they were supposed to construct or install rather a mobile substation. But that still does not mean Hawija has electricity generation capacity. IOM in the update to Parliament was supposed to do rubble clearance with a company called Tetra Tech. Well, the rubble's still there. We don't see anybody on the ground. The rubble might also be contaminated, because this was 18,000 kilos of ammunition, which was which exploded as a result of the secondary explosion. So we don't know how many bodies there are, whether it's still contaminated or not, so on and so forth. We've tried to get in touch with IOM between September and November about 5 times, and they've declined an interview. They declined to come to the launch in Erbil. They said they were not in a position to attend or to address any comments. So that has added another layer of frustration to what civilians already feel, that A, we were never compensated, B, you're now giving money in our name to the two agencies we do not trust and we do not see on the ground. So had it gone, let's say to Fahima Daoud, who we just saw on screen, say she has 17 persons living in her house. Her daughter and her has died because of cancer. Her daughter-in-law is suffering from cancer. She's buying pills for cancer in the black market, $4,000 a piece. She herself has cancer. There's 17 persons living in that house. Her son is disabled and cannot work. So where is the 4.4 million? How, there's been a lovely, a very positive change in the transparency law that we saw last week on Thursday. My question is, how can we respond to Fahima's questions or Abdullah Rashid's questions, who lost 7 members of his family? What about them?
Thank you. Danny, what did the people that you spoke to, what did they ask for? What did they need?
It depends who you talk to. Some people want to rebuild their shops, their homes, because many of them lost their houses. A lot of people there are traumatized of what happened. They probably need some help with that to, get rid of the images and the stuff that happened to them, and not only by the bomb, but of course occupation by ISIS. So it's totally different what people really need, but I think what they really want is some money to improve their lives and improve the way of living, and just start their life, because from their own government, I don't think they're going to get anything. So they're actually focusing their hope on the Netherlands and what the Dutch government can probably do for them.
Are they disappointed?
About what?
In the Dutch government?
Well, yeah, if you're there, I mean, at least somebody should go take a look and talk to the people and see what's really going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they're more disappointed by the Dutch government I mean, I felt ashamed.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I was there and I say, oh, well, I can't do nothing for you.
No.
I'm sorry about that. But they should at least talk to the people and listen to them. And if they've done that way back, or if they apologized at the beginning, I think people would be less angry about what happened, and probably wouldn't be that sad, because they're feeling that they're neglected. Nobody's listening to them. Nobody gives a shit about them. The people that died, you know, nobody is or listening to the stories, because a lot of people are very angry and very sad. And you know, if you say, well, you know, we did it, but it's not our responsibility, that doesn't sound good, or people are not really happy about how the Dutch government is handling the situation since the bomb.
And if I may add to that, the frustrations are definitely at three levels. At the governorate, what is the province here, at that level government, because they can also divert funds from NGOs where they go, so it can go to Hawija, but the bigger district and not the city. Mm-hmm. Then there's definitely the Iraqi government. The fact that they've been marginalized since the American occupation of 2003, that's, you know, added a different layer. And then, of course, the Dutch government. And we've constantly been also asked questions when we wrote this report, that why aren't you reporting on the frustrations that the civilians have on the Iraqi government? Well, the airstrike was by the Dutch government, so you cannot absolve yourself of that responsibility. That's just ridiculous to also just blame it on the Iraqi government and say we've done, you know, that's it.
I would like to add one more thing. I've spoken also to many people, and they told us the money should not go to anybody except us. So, to be honest, they don't have any faith in their own local government as well. So let's not try to, you know.
Exactly. And
so the money should go to the people who are actually, just like Lisbeth said.
And that's, by the way, if at any point there will be
any, yes.
Then that's again another issue on how to get. That's very, very basic, perhaps even banal. How do you get money to the people? Are they going to open bank accounts that they receive the money into that? We have experienced that in some cases, which weren't too easy experiences, I must say. But as you said, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, nothing can compensate for this, but the only thing that we can do is go for an acknowledgement, recognition by the court, a ruling saying this was wrong, this was against the law. Mm-hmm. The Dutch government will never apologize for this. That is my estimate, just based on my experience. If it will take decades, because if they're going to apologize for this case, very different, for example, from the case for Basim Razzo, which they did apologize for, there will be, as we saw in the first panel, there will be dozens of other cases they have to apologize for. And when will the next case come up in a similar situation? They feel wholeheartedly that this was right, that this was the only way to do it, and this was a military target, and it was collateral damage. And even if a court will say, you know, it was disproportional, yes, it was a military target, but it was disproportional, they may be obliged to pay, but that's different. So apologies, no. Yes. But acknowledgement from the court, yes. And then it will have to be implemented. But we are far from that. And that's something, just one more sentence. And that's difficult for the people. They have to bear with us. We always say, I mean, people that turn to us, law is very slow. This will take a long, long time. It will definitely be appealed. Either we win or we lose. The other party will appeal. The other party will go to the Supreme Court. So just add some 6-7 years to this. And where are the people by then? I mean, who's going to talk to them? Who's going to convince them to keep faith? And that's important, because without clients, I mean, there's no case and we'll never get to that point.
About Razzo, Mr. Razzo, it was a clear case. They knew they bombed the wrong houses. They killed his wife, his son, his brother, and his nephew. He and the wife of his brother survived. They knew he was looking for justice. They knew that they bombed the wrong houses. They didn't say nothing, just until the pilot, when he was, you know, like, oh, I made the mistake. That by then they acknowledged that they were wrong. I mean, this was a clear case. They could have said, we're sorry about it, we bombed the room. They didn't even do
No,
that.
they didn't.
No,
So let's not...
Until
yes.
they're forced, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
until the pilot
Yeah.
admitted that he did it.
Yeah.
And then
But that
they
was a
said they
clear
were sorry.
civilian target. And that was the difference with this case. That was done, once it came to the Netherlands jurisdiction, it was done within months. And that's because it was a clear civilian target.
Yes,
this
but-
was a military target.
yeah,
it was
we
a
were
bomb factory.
Yeah, but we're talking about saying sorry. They didn't even say sorry for that.
sorry to
Let
that,
us
yeah.
let
Well-
along Hawija.
Yeah, well, we had a meeting at the Ministry of Defense, and it was kind of, we gained some recognition from that. It wasn't, I fully agree, it wasn't a wholehearted or apology that you may be looking for. But I must say, if you say, how did that case stand out? That was done with, and we must be fair about that too, and give the credit to the government, it was dealt with within months. In a letter, it was one letter from me, it was a responding letter, we acknowledge, and we pay. And they did pay, and they paid soon. So, fair enough.
But what you just said, where will the people be? While we were conducting this research, so the actual one-on-one interviews took place between February and June. 3 persons had already died by then.
Yeah, that's it. That's the problem. I mean, by the time we're finished, in whatever, with whatever outcome, and that's always my worry. It's the worry with Ukraine. It's the worry with all these cases. We forget. I mean, now it's still important with the report. We have funding for NGOs to work on it. But who will still care in 5 years? Yeah. Normally, nobody.
People have tried committing suicide.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about legitimate military targets. Days before the Dutch airstrike, the French also targeted the Hawija Technical Institute, also was considered a fair or legitimate military target. There were no civilian casualties, but the French are paying for the rehabilitation of the Technical Institute, despite there being no civilian casualties.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to thank you very much for this conversation, because I think this is a good time to move on to politics. But before we do that, I want to look at a small video of Mohammed Abdul Karim Qatar. He is the head of program of the Iraqi NGO in Al-Ghat, and he was supposed to be here today, but something went wrong with his visa, which is really unfortunate. It shows how difficult it is sometimes to work together. But so let's watch what he has to say, and then we're going to move on to Erin Bell.
This is Mohammed Abdul Karim, the head of programs of Al-Ghad. I was working as a project coordinator of this project. At the beginning, we have a sample data of the victims and database. After that, we have collaboration with the PAX team. We're conducting this project with the support of the local authorities there. We conduct about 190 interviews with the people. Al-Ghad is a local NGO and have strong existence on the ground. This is help us and support us to raise this critical issue. Because, as you know, it is the people. It's not easy for the people to make anyone listen to their suffering. During about 7 months of the project, we conduct the interviews with the families who are affecting and with the different type of the effects from this incident.
And could you tell us something about how the people were thinking about the Netherlands when you were
Okay. At the beginning of the project, there are two visions. We have two visions of the people in Hawija about the Dutch. At the beginning of the project, the people have only one vision, that they are thought that the Dutch people and the Dutch government is the same person, and they are responsible for the incident. But after conducting this research and conduct mobilization awareness and mobilize these people that there are during the interviews and conducting awareness campaign, that there is a separate between the Dutch people and the Dutch government, and the Dutch people didn't agree of what happened in that night. And currently one of the main actor ISPAC's organization start to advocate and raise issue with the Dutch government. But currently, the people in Hawija have a bad feeling toward the Dutch government.
Yes, and what would they most like the government to do?
According to the interviews and the feedback that we got from people, that they want and asked for the formal apology of what happened, and to at least to member of the Dutch government visit Hawija and listen directly to the people. Also, some people they want a direct conversation. Also, they need to, for some people who are suffering from the health issue, to care of them. Also, they need from the humanitarian actors of the Dutch to focus their humanitarian efforts to industrial area.
Thank you very much, Mohammed.
And thank you to Lisbeth Zegveld, Danny Goosen, and Saba Azim. Thank you very much for being here. Now we're going to look a bit forward to the future, and we're going to do that by looking at some recommendations. Erin Bell, Senior Project Officer at PAX and co-author of the report, will highlight some of the recommendations that the report proposes. And in the meantime, I would like my next panel to take a seat.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So yes, I've been asked to say something about what we would recommend to the Dutch government, Dutch Ministry of Defense, and to the military going forward after Hawija. We, of course, wrote this report not only to look back at what had happened in Hawija in 2015 and what continued to happen afterwards, but also to see what needs to be done right now to address current needs of people, but also to identify what needs to be done differently in the future to prevent another Hawija from ever happening again. Now, a lot of recommendations can be made about this, but I'll try to keep it short. But first, at the outset, I want to stress one very important point, I think. And that's that I think that there's no looking forward after Hawija without first addressing the shortcomings or mistakes that were made in the past. I think also tonight, we must really try to resist the temptation to reduce Hawija to a kind of learning experience, to talk about it as something that regrettably went wrong in 2015, but that will teach us how to do better and do things differently in the future. If we talk about Hawija solely in that kind of way, we do nothing to address the grievances that people are feeling right now, and we dehumanize their experience in that way. I think it's important to realize that, of course, we will welcome new military procedures, new military doctrine, new policy, but to them, the people in Hawija, all these things, all these developments will eventually not matter much. Having said that, and I also hope that the next panel will take that to heart, I think militarily and politically speaking, there are many recommendations and key lessons that we can draw from Hawija, but I want to highlight just 3 of them. I think the first panel made it abundantly clear that also with sophisticated technologies, new weapon systems, we cannot actually wage war with few or no civilian casualties. And that is just talking about casualties and not even discussing the broader forms of civilian harm that were highlighted by the previous panel. The obvious recommendation being then that I think we should stop doing that. In future political decision-making, it's really important that we start having more honest and frank discussions about what the actual cost of war is, so that we can take that into account in discussing potentially new interventions. As to the second recommendation, if we then do decide to engage in another military mission, I think it becomes very clear from Hawija that before the Dutch commits to any kind of participation, it should be clear how civilian harm will be monitored, investigated, reported on transparently, as well as responded to in a way that addresses the needs of the victims. I furthermore strongly believe that it should be a baseline requirement for future Dutch military participation to any kind of coalition that the Netherlands ensures it has access to all relevant information regarding potential civilian harm resulting from its own operations, both before and after those operations took place. And third, and I think this also became very clear from the previous panel, we really need to do better, militaries in particular, to better take into account the potential reverberating civilian harm effects of their operations. As I said, more can be said about this, and I think we really encourage future debate about this as well. But I want to end with a fourth recommendation on the way forward, and that is one that is much more particular to Hawija. I think, well, I hope at least, I would recommend that we, and that whether that's us in the room this evening, the next panel, or the Dutch government more generally, that if we start to talk about a future after Hawija, I sincerely hope that we're not just talking about a future in which new policy is enacted to prevent another Hawija, but that we're also talking about a future in which meaningful apologies are made, even though it's unlikely. Let's hope it doesn't take the decades that Lisbeth just mentioned, and that meaningful steps are actually taken to address the current needs of victims of the airstrike. Because I think it's very clear from what we've heard today that almost 7 years later, people there are still waiting for that kind of response. So I hope that's the future after Hawija that we're actually talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Ja, we gaan wisselen naar het Nederlands. Ik had u daarvoor gewaarschuwd. Graag wil ik aan tafel... nee, het voelt een beetje onwennig. Sadet Karabulut, oud-Kamerlid voor de SP. Alexander Hammelburg, Kamerlid voor D66. En Lars Walraven, directeur internationale gelegenheden bij het ministerie van Defensie. Fijn dat u hier bent vanavond. En u... in het bijzonder zou ik willen zeggen, want het is toch fijn dat het is hoopvol dat het ministerie...
Het zou vanzelfsprekend moeten zijn wat mij betreft.
Maar toch is het heel, ik denk dat het heel hoopvol is. En ik wil ook bij u beginnen, meneer Walraven. Hoe luistert u naar de voorgaande gesprekken? En misschien dan toch ook even als mens en als ambtenaar.
Ik weet niet of er een verschil is. Hoe luister ik ernaar? Nee, de verhalen zijn verschrikkelijk. Laten we daar heel duidelijk over zijn. En tegelijk, ik snap de oproep, waar Erin net mee eindigde, heel goed. Laten we vooruitkijken, maar laten we ook vooral terugkijken. Nou, ik zal vooral vooruitkijken vanavond vanuit mijn rol en positie. Omdat het voor mij gewoon lastig is om terug te kijken, omdat het vooral een politiek standpunt is. Maar ik denk dat dit wel ook wel bij ons een verandering gebracht heeft. Het denken over hoe gaan we hiermee om. En vooral naar die toekomst toe. Hoe gaan we hiermee om? Hoe zijn we hier transparant over? Hoe zijn we aan de voorkant? Ik wil graag reageren op een aantal mensen die zeiden... clean wars bestaan niet. Nee, ze bestaan niet. Precisiewapens, de wapens zijn wel misschien precies. Maar zowel in Mosul als in Hawija hebben we gezien... dat ook een precies wapen kan leiden tot onschuldige slachtoffers. Mm-hmm. Dus dat...
Dank u wel. U noemt al de transparantie.
Heet Lars en je graag.
Oké, dat zal ik proberen. Dank, Lars. Je noemt al de transparantie. Sadet, ik wil heel even terug, want jij was toen Kamerlid toen dit speelde. Kun je iets zeggen over die transparantie? Want dat ging volgens mij niet helemaal goed.
Nou ja, dat was er natuurlijk niet. Nee. Dat is evident. En evident is ook, en dat is uitgekomen... door onderzoek en onderzoeksjournalisten dat er glashard is gelogen. Mm-hmm. En allereerst ook vanuit mijn kant, ik ben echt ongelooflijk dankbaar voor iedereen die zich inzet voor de waarheid. Voor alle organisaties, mensen, journalisten, medewerkers die hier heel hard op hebben gewerkt. En ik moet zeggen, het eerste wat mij dan vanavond opvalt als ik alle goede sprekers hoor, is, nu wordt bijvoorbeeld heel gemakkelijk gezegd, schone oorlogen bestaan niet. Maar toch is dat jarenlang het frame, het narratief geweest vanuit de politiek om deze oorlog te voeren, mm-hmm. te kunnen voeren. En dat heeft er natuurlijk alles mee te maken dat wanneer je steun zou vragen aan je volksvertegenwoordiging, maar ook aan het brede publiek, met het verhaal, we hebben bommen, we willen een vijand verslaan, maar daar gaan ook heel veel slachtoffers bij kunnen vallen, dat doorgaans de bevolking en 99% van de mensen helemaal geen zin heeft in een oorlog. En dus wordt er een frame eigenlijk uitgerold. En in dit geval, als we kijken naar Hawija, is dat jarenlang ook echt volgehouden.
Want wanneer werd de Kamer hierover geïnformeerd?
Nou ja, alvorens een kabinet, de regering, inzet pleegt, militaire inzet, wordt de Kamer natuurlijk geïnformeerd. De artikel 100, strikt formeel genomen, hoeven ze geen Kamermeerderheid, geen instemming van de Kamer. Maar goed, dat is wel gangbaar. In die artikel 100-brief wordt besproken wat de doelen zijn van zo'n operatie, et cetera, et cetera. En daarin, en in die communicatie over en weer, wordt natuurlijk ook uiteengezet wat de doelen zijn van de operatie en hoe men die wil gaan bereiken. En daar is op verschillende momenten door voormalige bewindspersonen ook echt gecommuniceerd dat het gaat om precisiewapens, dat er geen slachtoffers zouden vallen, dat het allemaal geweldig zou zijn. En ja, je moet je voorstellen, ik hoop en zie ook dat het steeds meer verandert, maar dat je in Den Haag eigenlijk van hele goede huizen moet komen als je kritische vragen stelt over een militaire missie. En in dit geval de War on Terror als onderdeel van de War on Terror tegen IS. Dus heel veel wordt ook niet besproken en heel veel vragen blijven onbeantwoord, zeker vooraf. En dus kan het gebeuren dat dat vreemd heel lang stand houdt. En in dit hele concrete geval hebben wij er, mijn voorganger toen was ik toen deze oorlog begon, was ik geen woord voor de buitenlandse zaken, maar mijn voorganger en ons team, onze medewerkers, die hebben toen ook gevraagd, vlak daarna, toen wij hoorden dat er een incident was, had Nederland hiermee te maken? En dat is gewoon ontkend. En precies rondom die periode werd er een besluit genomen over verlenging van de missie. Ja. En daarna is dat nog een keer ontkend en nog een keer ontkend en nog een keer ontkend. Totdat men er niet meer omheen kon vanwege de onderzoeksjournalistiek en het vrijkomen van allerlei andere gegevens.
Lars, mag ik vragen, wat ging er mis in de informatievoorziening volgens jou?
Ja, wat ging er mis? Ik vind dat lastig om te duiden. Kijk, achteraf kan je inderdaad zeggen, misschien hadden we alles anders of een heleboel dingen anders moeten doen. Ik denk dat het ook wel belangrijk is om toch het tegengeluid te horen. De context van destijds, de opkomst van ISIS. Er moet iets gebeuren. Dat zijn we gaan doen. Ook tegen een achtergrond van aanslagen in Europa. Dan moet je de afweging militair ook blijven maken van wat deel je, wat kan je niet delen, hoe kan je het delen, welke risico's loop je daarmee. Keuzes zijn gemaakt zoals ze zijn gemaakt. Of die goed zijn of slecht zijn, daar vind ik even niks van, zeg maar. Maar tegen deze achtergrond zijn wel die besluiten en die beslissingen genomen. Ja. In de loop der tijden schuift dat op. Je ziet ook dat we meer zijn gaan vertellen, meer overzichten zijn gaan geven wat we doen. Je ziet dat we nu ook aangeven wanneer we het wel of niet, wanneer we het niet zijn geweest. De vragen die vanuit de journalistiek komen, zijn jullie betrokken bij? Daar geven we inmiddels ook antwoord op. En zo zie je dat we wel die kant op zijn gegaan. Ook de artikel 100-brief die ze net al aanhaalden. Waarin we nu.
Wat is dat?
Dat is een brief die de regering naar de Kamer stuurt, waarin ze aangeven inderdaad van wat gaan we doen en hoe gaan we het doen, welke risico's zijn erbij. Eigenlijk omschrijven de doelen, de middelen en de risico's. Waarbij we het ook expliciet aangegeven hebben. Daar gaan we dus ook aandacht besteden aan dat risico op burgerslachtoffers. Ja. Hoe gaan we daarover rapporteren? Hoe gaan we daar in een evaluatie specifiek aandacht voor vragen? Want in
het eerste panelgesprek hoorde ik dat moet op 0 staan. Is dat nog steeds zo?
Moet op 0 staan, het aantal burgerslachtoffers.
Mogelijke burgerslachtoffers?
Kijk, je streeft er altijd naar. Maar ik denk dat het een illusie is dat altijd kan. En nog even los van waar we het over hadden, die proportionaliteit. Het legitieme militaire doel versus het risico op burgerslachtoffers. Maar in een oorlog vallen doden en ook onschuldige doden. Ik denk dat we daar gewoon duidelijk over moeten zijn.
Is die transparantie veranderd, ziet u?
Ja, die is nu echt aan het veranderen, zoals Lars ook zegt, naar aanleiding van Hawija. En helaas moet je daarbij constateren, zijn mijn voorganger Saadet en haar voorgangers heel hard bezig geweest om te kijken welke lessen kun je nu in het algemeen trekken om te zorgen dat de volgende keer als Nederland de beslissing nemen om een oorlog in te gaan, dat wel gebeurt op basis van de juiste afwegingen. En wat mij dan zo verschrikkelijk veel verbaast, ik heb ooit in een niet al te ver verleden heb ik nog oorlogsrecht gedoseerd hier aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. En iedereen die zich daar een beetje mee bezighoudt, en het werd net ook alweer door andere sprekers gezegd, die weet gewoon, op het moment dat je een beslissing over oorlog neemt, gaat het niet alleen over het oorlogsrecht, het humanitair recht tijdens die oorlog, maar de afwegingen die je maakt naar aanloop van die oorlog, maar ook op het moment dat die oorlog afgelopen is, hoe moeilijk dat ook te bepalen is, wat je dan gaat doen. Dat is een morele verplichting die je hebt. En het hele feit dat het in het gebruik in de Kamer en het gebruik in Den Haag, maar ook in wetten niet vervat is, zeker voor een land als Nederland, Den Haag, Vredespaleis, je zou toch denken, nou, we moeten hier echt voorop lopen. Dat is nog niet geborgd. Dus mijn voorganger met collega's, die heeft ook ervoor gezorgd dat in bijvoorbeeld die artikel 100 brief, dat er nu ook wordt gekeken naar wat verwachten we aan burgerslachtoffers bijvoorbeeld. Maar ik zou ook willen zeggen, wat verwacht je dat onze rol en onze verantwoordelijkheid is op het moment dat die bommen zijn gevallen, de oorlog voorbij is, wat is dan je rol in die wederopbouw? En bijvoorbeeld in die compensatie. En hoe geef je dat vorm? Want we hebben nu Hawija. Ik woonde ten tijde van die hele oorlog zelf tijdelijk in Damascus. Ben ook nog vaker in de oorlog in Syrië terug geweest en heb trouwens ook even over de context gesproken van toen, de pure destructie gezien die door ISIS is aangericht in Syrië. Laten we dat ook echt niet vergeten. Want Yakuzba, wat een verschrikkelijk nare organisatie is dat. En het heeft niets meer met recht te maken in oorlogsrecht. Maar ja, je moet wel heel goed bedenken hoe je daar voor de oorlog, maar vooral ook na de oorlog mee omgaat. We hebben Syrië, we hebben Irak, we hebben het vanavond over Hawija, we hebben het over Afghanistan en al die andere oorlogen waar Nederland bij betrokken is. Dat kan niet.
Nee, een van de aanbevelingen net was ook in elk geval voordat er iets wordt uitgevoerd, het kijken hoe brengen we in kaart, hoe zorgen we dat we al vooraf implementeren dat we kijken naar hoeveel burgerslachtoffers er vallen. Hoe denken we daarover na? Lars, kun je daar iets over zeggen?
Ik denk dat dat het deel is wat we altijd al deden. Ik bedoel, militairen hebben geen enkel belang bij burgerslachtoffers, integendeel. Maar het gebeurt wel soms, ondanks alle voorzorgsmaatregelen. Er worden gewoon vergissingen gemaakt, er worden fouten gemaakt. Ik denk dat dat besef eigenlijk in de organisatie wel behoorlijk verankerd zit. Maar het gaat erover hoe transparant zijn we erover. Wat doen we ermee als het gebeurd is? Dat de volgende stap is.
Ja. Want ik hoor hier wel natuurlijk uit het onderzoek dat men eerst dacht dat het 70 burgerdoden waren. Het blijken er een stuk meer te zijn. En in het eerste panel kwam ook naar voren van wiens taak is het om dat uit te, naar voren te brengen? Is dat de taak van de journalistiek? Is dat niet nu de taak van de regering zelf?
Over de cijfers heeft de Nederlandse overheid altijd gezegd dat we het niet wisten. De Amerikanen zijn uitgegaan van 70, op basis inderdaad van journalisten ter plaatse. Er circuleerden ook berichten over 150. Er circuleerden diverse getallen. Dat het er 85 zijn, dat verbaast ook niemand. Ja, wiens taak is het? Nou, daar hebben we als overheid ook een rol in. Alleen op dat moment zat ISIS nog gewoon in Hawija. Tot nog toe hebben wij geoordeeld dat het niet veilig is voor overheidspersoneel om ter plaatse te gaan. Dat is op dit moment het denken. Dat kan ook met de tijd veranderen uiteraard. Maar wij vinden wel dat we daar een grotere rol in moeten gaan vervullen. Dus dat hebben we ook gemeld vorige week in een brief die we gestuurd hebben, dat we daar wel naar moeten kijken om meer eigenstandig of zelfstandig het onderzoek te kunnen doen. Met alle beperkingen uiteraard die er wellicht zijn, maar dat we daar wel een rol zien. Ja, zeker.
Ja, volgens mij je weet ook bij iedere oorlog op basis van de ervaringen uit het verleden, weet je gewoon op het moment dat je kijkt naar wat voor gebied ga je die aanvallen uitvoeren. Twee dingen. Je weet hoeveel bij dit soort bombardementen in het verleden, hoeveel slachtoffers er bij zijn gevallen. En dat geeft je gewoon de mogelijkheid om ramingen te geven voor de toekomstige aanvallen. Maar het is ook zoiets als ik Lisbeth mag zeggen, want ik ken je eigenlijk nog niet. Wel van naam, maar we waren toch aan het tutoyeren hier aan tafel. Maar ook de vraag, op het moment dat je het hebt over zo'n precisiebombardement in stedelijk gebied, wat doe je in de stappen voorafgaand aan dat bombardement? Er zijn heel veel legers die een code of conduct hebben. Ook legers waar we nog steeds heel veel kritiek op hebben, die gooien briefjes uit en die waarschuwen mensen zodat ze tijd hebben om te vluchten. Er zijn allerlei waarborgen in het internationaal recht, in het humanitair oorlogsrecht, om dat te borgen. En de vraag is dat hier dus, doet Nederland dat stelselmatig? Dus ik vind dat ook een hele legitieme vraag en ik heb daar wel mijn vraagtekens bij. Dus het is op alle fronten, aan de voorkant, tijdens die oorlog en naar afloop, wil je eigenlijk weten, hoe doet Nederland dat nou in zijn algemeen? En ik ben dan ook heel erkentelijk aan Pax en aan Rad voor het gedegen onderzoek. En ik wacht ook met veel eagerness het onderzoek van de commissie Zorgdrager nog af en de rechtszaak. Maar hier moet echt nog wel heel veel gebeuren.
Ja. Zodat ik heel even jou kans geven om te reageren. En daarna wil ik toch even naar de toekomst. Wil jij hier iets aan toevoegen?
Ja, nou, 2 dingen. Ik denk allereerst wat enorm belangrijk is bij militaire missies en Nederlandse deelname daaraan. Kijk, de gewoonte is, en dat durf ik echt zo te stellen, de gewoonte in Nederland is dat wanneer de bondgenoten vragen, wij meestal draaien. En van die gewoonte moeten we af. Want even deze oorlog in breder context plaatsen, dit is natuurlijk mede begonnen na 9/11, de War on Terror, illegale invasie in Irak, van waaruit eigenlijk de IS is geboren. En inmiddels al die interventies in al die landen, Afghanistan, Irak, Syrië, weer Irak, hebben ertoe geleid dat ondertussen tenminste 37 miljoen mensen, ook intern ontheemden, op de vlucht zijn. Mede door het toedoen van onze bombardementen. Die, volgens mij was het in de tweede ronde wat al werd genoemd, hele steden zijn plat gebombardeerd. Dus van dat automatisme moeten we af. En daarmee bedoel ik, voordat je zo'n missie aangaat, maar ook gedurende en tijdens de missie, waar je tussendoor debatten hebt die vaak over heel weinig gaan, kan ik daarbij vertellen, moet je kijken naar de effectiviteit. Eén klein kort voorbeeld. Tijdens de Afghanistan-oorlog zagen wij gebeuren dat het steeds maar onveiliger werd. En dat leger werd maar geen leger, corruptie aan alle kanten. Vragen daarover werden niet beantwoord. Nou, en dan sta je op zo'n moment vrij alleen in de Kamer. Dus dat moet veranderen. Het tweede, wat volgens mij cruciaal is, en dat sluit aan bij wat jullie zeggen, maar dan nog net iets concreter, is als je besluit om mee te doen aan een militaire missie en inderdaad op een moderne manier, namelijk met bommen en je ziet niet wat er gebeurt op de grond. En je kunt dat niet controleren. En je kunt niet rapporteren richting de slachtoffers of je eigen parlement en je bevolking, moet je er niet aan beginnen. Niet doen. Ten derde, we hebben het nu over 2 bombardementen gehad, waarvan we het weten. Maar er zijn nog 2098 andere bombardementen uitgevoerd. Die gegevens moeten vrijgegeven worden, zodat organisaties zoals Pax en anderen en journalisten kunnen controleren of daar een match is. Zodat Nederland, wij, onze regering, de verantwoordelijkheid kan nemen. En dan komt het hele proces van, wat doe je dan met mensen? Ja, natuurlijk, ik snap Danny Gozer heel erg goed als hij zegt, ja, ik ga daar naartoe en ik schaam me, want mijn regering is hier nog niet geweest. Met alle respect voor het argument van de veiligheid, maar die wordt er voortdurend bijgesleept wanneer het lastig wordt. Dat moet gewoon echt, met al dit onderzoekswerk, het prachtige rapport, wat gelukkig mede mogelijk is gemaakt door onze eigen overheid, maar dat moet wel gebeuren. Dat zijn zo'n beetje de stappen die gezet moeten worden. En natuurlijk moeten we leren de waarheid te vertellen, hoe moeilijk dat ook is, over oorlogsvoering.
Ja. Lars, ik wil toch eerst jou nog even de mogelijkheid geven om te reageren.
Terugkomend op iets wat Sadet net ook zei. Op het moment dat we het parlement volledig en transparant aan de voorkant informeren, is de vraag of we nog oorlog gaan voeren. Ja. Dat is de ene kant. De andere kant kan zijn door juist transparant te zijn en het vertrouwen te vragen. Denk ik dat je een zinvolle discussie kan voeren in ieder geval over wat je gaat doen. Dat je nooit meer oorlog moet voeren,
maar dat is niet wat ik zeg.
Nee, dat weet ik ook. Maar
liever niet.
Nee, precies.
Ik zie het iedere dag weer, maar
Precies. En juist door als overheid ook transparant te zijn, ook over de risico's, denk ik dat je een betere afweging kan maken met z'n allen. En dat kan meerdere kanten opvallen, dat snap ik ook goed. Maar ik denk wel dat we dat gesprek moeten voeren. En dat is ook wat je ziet. Overigens, andere punt, meer transparantie. Een van de dingen die we vorige week ook aangekondigd hebben, was dat we ook kijken naar het openbaar maken van meer gegevens over de aanvallen die we uitgevoerd hebben. Dus ook die oproep is gehoord. Nog geen beloftes, maar in ieder geval wel de toezegging om daar naar te kijken. Ja.
Ik kijk even naar u, want we hebben een hoop gehoord over de compensatie en dat die niet terecht is gekomen waar die misschien terecht zou moeten komen. U zit in de coalitie op dit moment. Kan dat niet anders?
Ja, dat is een hele goede vraag. Ja, dat vind ik dus ook een uitstekende vraag. Als ik ergens van schrik in het rapport, is de schaal, de magnitude. Je ziet dat, en dat hoorden we net ook, dat die 4,4 miljoen verre van voldoende is voor alleen al de schade in Hawija. En ik zei het niet voor niets, hè. Als je een oorlog begint, dan moet je ook een plan hebben voor hoe ga je compenseren of in ieder geval meewerken aan die wederopbouw. Want kijk naar dit beeld. Mm-hmm. Je wil het zo niet achterlaten, want je deed het ook om die burgerbevolking te beschermen tegen de criminelen van ISIS. Mm-hmm. Dus dat is de eerste. Ja, 4,4 is volgens het rapport duidelijk niet voldoende. Maar dit gaat alleen over Hawija. En ik zou eigenlijk dus wel willen weten, en het is precies zoals Saad het ook zegt, hoe zit het met al die andere bombardementen en hoe zit het met die andere schade? Ja. En we moeten niet vergeten dat Nederland heeft bijgedragen aan wederopbouwplannen voor Irak. En ook er gaat heel veel geld ook wel indirect en direct naar delen van Syrië. Maar de vraag is, komt dat bij de juiste mensen terecht? Ja. En daar zit de kern van het probleem. Ik zie dus elke keer, en dat is bij ieder wederopbouwproject en eigenlijk ook vaak bij doodhulpprojecten, die worden met de beste bedoelingen uitgegeven, maar zodra ze via overheidsstructuren of gezaghebbers gaan, komen ze bijna nooit bij de slachtoffers terecht. En dat is echt een heel groot probleem. Ik snap de ingewikkeldheid van deze context, want je komt er ook niet zomaar in en je hebt te maken met veiligheidsissues. Maar je zou toch willen weten met ons belastinggeld dat bedoeld is voor die mensen die slachtoffer zijn. Als die in zakken verdwijnt van corrupte leiders of overheden ver buiten die steden waar gebombardeerd is. Ja, wat heb je er dan aan? Dus ja, dit is wel echt aanleiding voor mij om ook weer verder te gaan verdiepen in en te kijken van, goh, wat is hier nou goed gegaan, maar wat is hier vooral ook niet goed gegaan? Wat is er nodig?
Ja, die 4,4 miljoen, we weten niet precies waar die nu is en die is nu weg. Dus de vraag is of dat ooit toch ergens... nee?
Nou, weg, ja.
Ik zou niet willen zeggen niet weg. Er is gewoon gezegd, we gaan een tweetal projecten uitvoeren. Ja. Wie is daar het meest op toegerust? Gerenommeerde organisaties, UNDP, IOM, die ook met lokale partners op de grond werken, die gesproken hebben ook met mensen in Hawija en in de omgeving. Gaat het snel genoeg? Nee, het gaat niet snel genoeg. Zijn de resultaten al voldoende zichtbaar? Nee, dat zijn ze nog niet. Dat gaat langzaam. Dat gaat langzamer ook dan wij zouden willen. Maar die resultaten gaan wel komen wat ons betreft. En daar gaan ook dingen van gezien worden. Is dat dan voldoende? Daar kan je de discussie over voeren. Maar als we het hierover hebben, volgende rapportage komt ergens volgende maand volgens mij. Die hebben de Kamer toegezegd om daar halfjaarlijks over te rapporteren. Mm-hmm. Dan kunnen we ook aangeven waar we staan op dat moment. Ja.
Maar ja, misschien een suggestie. Want we hebben allemaal het rapport natuurlijk, maar ook de indringende beelden gezien. Hè? Van de documentaire van Danny Goosen en zijn team. Wat je daar ziet is gewoon verminkte gezichten. Even los van de verhalen die ons denk ik allemaal naar de keel grijpen. Zeg ik even, toch ook aan een constructie kunnen denken dat nu wij zoveel voeten wel op de grond hebben daar en zoveel contacten en zoveel goede mensen daar bezig zijn die de slachtoffers en nabestaanden, zeg ik daar nadrukkelijk bij, hebben zien te bereiken, dat we daar in ieder geval als overheid, als verantwoordelijk bewindspersonen die compensatie voor regelen, zodat ze geopereerd kunnen worden, zodat ze een leven kunnen opbouwen. Dat is toch een heel basale opzet waarbij je die toch op een bepaalde manier individueel de mensen, dat leed neem je natuurlijk nooit weg, maar zou kunnen compenseren. Is dat geen idee?
Nou ja, de vraag is, en dat is mijn grote zorg bij zo'n individuele compensatie. Hoe ga je dat uitzetten terwijl het ziekenhuis plat ligt? Dat is mijn grootste zorg op dit moment in de stad als Hawija en al die andere steden die gebombardeerd zijn. Dus nogmaals, Nee, laat ik het zo zeggen. Ik denk dat prioriteit 1 absoluut is om de infrastructuur op poten te krijgen. Vooral de gezondheidszorg. En te zorgen dat je aan die wederopbouw doet. En die 4,4 is het grote probleem. En dan komt inderdaad de aansprakelijkheid. En dat is toch wel belangrijk. En dat is een hele kille juridische discussie, zoals Liesbeth net ook zei. Maar is wel een hele belangrijke om te voeren. Dus ik zou zeggen, op het moment dat blijkt dat het wel onrechtmatig was, in tegenstelling tot wat de regering zegt, ja, dan zou je echt te maken hebben met een compensatieregeling.
Ik wilde juist even uit die kille juridische discussie
dat snap
blijven.
ik, maar zou dit, heel veel slachtoffers in Hawija, maar je zegt net zelf ook, zoveel meer plaatsen in Irak, maar ook in Syrië en ook nog in Afghanistan, laten we dat ook niet vergeten, waar wij echt heel veel werk, heel veel verantwoordelijkheid hebben om te blijven opbouwen. En dat moeten we vooral ook heel erg doen. Maar het, helaas, maar waar, gaat ook niet alleen over deze 70, 85 mensen en hun nabestaanden. Het gaat over heel veel meer mensen die zorg nodig hebben omdat ze slachtoffer zijn geworden van een oorlog en ook bombardementen van Nederland en ook van bondgenoten. Waarvan je zegt, ja, daar moet echt heel veel meer gebeuren.
Er zijn natuurlijk veel meer slachtoffers, maar ik denk dan toch ook altijd, misschien een hele simpele gedachte, maar je kan toch ook ergens beginnen. En die 4,4 miljoen, wie ligt er dan dwars voor meer compensatie? Lars, je zei net ook, dit zou wel sneller kunnen. Dus dan toch, waarom gaat het niet sneller en waarom is er niet meer geld?
Nou ja, ik denk dat als je van die 4,4 miljoen en waarom dat niet op de juiste plek terechtkomt en waarom het, ik vermoed, nog op de plank ligt. Waarschijnlijk vanwege organisatorische, maar ik ben hier dus ook nog mee bezig om dit uit te zoeken. Hè, laten we dat vooropstellen. Daar maak ik me grote zorgen over. En dan denk ik, joh, dat kan toch heel veel sneller en dat moet heel veel sneller. Zeker in Hawija. Kijk, er zijn bepaalde gebieden van Syrië waar je weet dat het gewoon nog echt onmogelijk is. Maar hier zou het toch wel mogelijk moeten zijn. Dus dit is echt iets waar ik nu mee bezig ben om dit nu uit te zoeken. En het rapport helpt me gewoon ontzettend veel. Omdat er zoveel duidelijk bewijs is van die schade en individuele impact ook. Maar als je toch kijkt naar die compensatie, en ik vind dat een hele ingewikkelde, want je hebt zoveel meer mensen die slachtoffer zijn geworden van deze oorlog en bombardementen van Nederland, van België, van de Verenigde Staten. Maar laten we het even bij onszelf en onze eigen verantwoordelijkheid houden. Waarvan ik vind dat ze allemaal de juiste zorg verdienen. Dat ze allemaal verdienen dat winkelstraten en huizen worden opgeknapt. En dat er echt weer geld instroomt, zodat er echt aan de wederopbouw kan worden begonnen.
Het probleem hier is natuurlijk dat beide niet gebeurt.
Nee, maar dat is precies het probleem dat ik hier ook constateer. Ja.
Lars?
Het kwam net ook al voorbij. Ik kan hier weinig over zeggen. De Iraakse overheid speelt hier een rol. Wij doen wat. Dat kan sneller. Ja, en meer of anders is gewoon een politiek besluit. Dus daar.
Dank. Ik dank jullie wel dat jullie hier waren. En blijf alsjeblieft nog heel even zitten. Ik kijk ook even naar u. Ik ben een beetje aan het uitlopen. Dat was ook wel te verwachten met de hoeveelheid sprekers die we hadden uitgenodigd vanavond. Ik hoop dat u dat... u zit er allemaal nog, dus eigenlijk hoef ik nergens iets over te zeggen. Als iemand een vraag heeft of iets wil zeggen, heel graag. Ik denk dat we dat doen tot 10:15. Als u denkt, ik moet echt mijn trein halen, dan is nu ook een goed moment om dat te doen. Want dan doen we nog een kwartier vragen. Dat lijkt mij heel zinvol. En die vragen mogen natuurlijk aan de sprekers aan tafel, maar mogen ook aan... you can also ask the questions to any other person that was at this table this evening. So if I can have a little bit of light. And my colleague Veronica will move towards you. Ja.
Dus we gaan weer terug naar het Engels, begrijp ik?
Dit mag ook in Nederlands, mag ook in het Engels. Engels is denk ik...
Ik doe wel het Engels in.
Als het kan, heel graag.
Well, first I'd like to thank all the speakers present here tonight. And my question is directed at the Director of the International Affairs of the MOD. In the first session, Lauren Gould and Azmat Khan reflected on the question why the Dutch seem so eager to conduct this strike. And I'm very interested to hear your reflections on this question. Maybe solve this for them even.
To be honest, it's not something we recognize. It's a very, well, short, but I hope clear answer from our side.
Danny, yeah?
Just what does that mean? That you didn't recognize?
It means that I don't recognize, or we don't recognize, the eagerness.
Sorry. So have you read the document, the investigative document into it?
Yeah.
And within that,
everything.
with the pressure that's being described to execute this strike, to bring it to an executable level, from that, and the fact that they had to also turn it around in a short time frame so that the Dutch could carry it out, none of that suggests to you that there was some intention for the Dutch to do this specifically?
It's all about interpretation of reading the document.
I think we could have a full debate on this tonight.
Let's do so.
Just kidding. Can I have one last?
If I may, just last.
Yes, that's okay.
So there's the document, right? And then there is, do you have evidence to show otherwise? That this was something that perhaps the Dutch pushed back on? Or anything to show us the route through which the Dutch grappled with this particular decision? Because you're disputing the interpretation of a document that exists. Yet can you back that up with any further evidence to make the point that you're claiming, that there was not that enthusiasm?
What you see in these procedures, there are always doubts. If there are no doubts in these type of targeting procedures, then I think the planners don't do their jobs. Because you really want to strive for a result where you minimize the collateral damage. So there is discussion and there is interpretation within this process, and there's trying to do as good as possible. The attack was executed at night. Why? Because it was expected there were less people on the streets at night. So these are things that are taken into account and looked into.
Danny?
Yes, I would like to ask the gentleman, because you guys are saying like we want to be transparent. When we were in Iraq 2021, like a couple of months ago, there were more bombings, there were more civilian deaths, like too many to call up. We asked the Dutch, we asked your department actually, like, were you the ones who bombed? To our surprise, you said, no, we did not bomb. We had 2 cases that we wanted to know if you bombed it. You said no. So we said, where did you bomb? Because the Dutch government says, you know, there were only 4 incidents where some people died. If there were only 4 incidents in Iraq, why not give us the locations where you bombed and let us journalists go and see for ourselves if you are telling the truth or not?
That's what I just mentioned. Yes, we're in the process of looking into making public all the attacks we did, or at least more information about the attacks. I don't know about the level of details, but that's what we promised last week to Parliament.
And when can we expect? When can we expect that?
I'm not going to give you a timeline on that one.
Might be in the year 2055.
If you're pessimistic, yes, but that's not our intention, of course.
Alexander, you said that you want some change as well.
Yeah.
The Minister of Defense is from your own party. D66. Why don't you like push her a little bit to give us this information that this gentleman will give us some time?
Absolutely. It's not only about this information, but it's everything in the process actually that needs to be more transparent. And I do understand that certain things are classified also for the protection of the army. I do understand that. But to be very frank, there are so many parts of the process where the transparency is absolutely not a problem at all, and we don't have it at all. So yes, definitely, we have to look into this, and this is exactly what I'm working on right now. And I sincerely do not hope 2055, to be honest. I sincerely hope that we can do this actually within the next year.
Okay. Is there somebody else who has a question? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've heard many intentions in this panel discussion, but no any evidence to suggest that this will not happen again. So I would like to hear your reflections on how you would change in order to prevent this, rather than we intend this to be different, we interpret this more positive than you pose it at this moment. Because I don't see any reason why this would not happen again based on this panel. So I would like to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
From all of us, I assume. Yeah, no. To be very frank, I'm doing defense for. I'm a new Parliament member, so this is something I told you about my background. So this is something that I'm extremely worried about, and I see every time and again for every word that I've analyzed in the past, also when I was still working at the university, that the decisions are not being made based on the expectancies on cost, human lives, infrastructure, and everything that you have. And always it's extremely and super political. It has to do with building allies, with the pressure of the United States very often and very unfortunately. And we have to make our own assessments on this, very much based on the costs of human lives, also for non-intervention, by the way, because this is something that many people don't mention. Sometimes you have to make a horrible decision on costs and benefits, also when it comes to human lives in warfare. So this is definitely something that needs to be part of any procedure in the future. And this is exactly what we've been working on. My colleague, my predecessor, Salima Belhai, has actually filed 4 motions to get this done. And that's going to be coming to the Parliament this year, even before summer. So there is action actually right now to prevent such decisions from being made without thoroughly understanding what the cost would be and a proper political discussion based on the facts and the impact on people's lives. So I don't share your pessimism there. But I do know history, and there was reason definitely for pessimism, because Hawija is not an incident by itself. It's time and again that this has happened, definitely.
Kijk naar u, wilt u?
Well, I already reflected on it. I think we must start now, really must start now by answering the questions of Danny, for example. We can start now by you pushing your minister, going there, and talking with the people at least, maybe some kinds of apologies, because they are angry, and they are right that they are angry. And I think that, I do agree on that we must stop pushing forever wars and supporting forever wars that create more terrorism than less.
Yep. Ik zie nog 4 vragen. Ik ga proberen ze allemaal te doen, maar als u dan een korte vraag wil stellen, ben ik heel gelukkig.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just like to ask you, all 3 of you, to ask about what would you say if any of the victims would be in a room right now, which you have seen on the videos and have read in the reports. Would your statements or your thoughts be any different? I was just wondering about that.
No, it would be the same, of course, for me.
No, and I've been speaking to many victims. I've been there, and I've been to all the refugee camps. I know all the stories. Yeah.
And same for me. Answers wouldn't be different.
I think it's very important that as this work has been done, and it's really precious, and there are the contexts that we keep on pushing for the solutions. We can't say, oh, but these are 70 or 80 or maybe 90, we don't know, but there are also the other places. Yes, but let's start here and then go to all the other places. I think that's the thing that I would say to them. I will fight for you, for your rights, for recognition. And that's the basic human thing that we can do, isn't it?
2 more questions in the back, and I'm going to have those as the last questions.
Thank you very much to the panelists and the researchers. I have a question for the researchers more specifically. I was intrigued by your point and the methodology that you should not only look at the number of victims, but that you should also look at the second-degree effects of harm. I was wondering if you also considered turning that around and interpreting the number of victims and the harm that was prevented by conducting these airstrikes, by taking out what it was, a car bomb factory that would be used against civilians for bombings. So have you also considered looking into the intention of these bombings, namely the prevention of more harm and more killings?
Thank you. Is there who wants to answer?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, academically, that's a total no-go, of course. That's the kind of coulda, shoulda, woulda, possibly type of question that as an academic and as a researcher you could not possibly try and answer. This happened, that's a fact, and the impact of what happened needs to be investigated as carefully and as evidence-based and as robust as possible. That's what we did. We triangulated, we used all kinds of different methodologies, in-depth interviews, satellite images analysis. We corroborated this with secondary literature and stakeholder interviews. And in that way, we build a very robust story about what happened and what was the impact of this airstrike and who was responsible for it. So that's the work we do, and all other questions are purely, I'd say, political and hypothetical, and to me, completely useless. So that would be my answer.
Saba? Yeah, I see two more reactions, and then I can...
The other thing that we also asked the civilians on the ground was, what methodology could have been used, so to speak, or what methods of warfare could have been used. And that's where the entire thing of remote warfare comes into place. Why weren't there more boots on the ground? Because they felt that this attack was not indiscriminate, as was the narrative that we've been hearing for God knows since when. So had there been boots on the ground, they would have more accurate information, more accurate intelligence. The fact that the industrial district is not an industrial area alone, but there are actually neighborhoods around it. There are actually residential neighborhoods around it. And the fact that they could have taken out that factory with boots on the ground, they could have taken out ISIS with boots on the ground rather than just firing your bombs and saying, okay, oops. Not even saying sorry, but oops.
Lisbeth? Oh, 1 second before Veronica.
I wanted to mention that from a humanitarian law perspective, the question that was just raised is relevant, because if you're deciding on proportionality, you of course have to weigh the military advantage to the human cost. Now, if there are 80 people killed, you're a bit losing sight, of course, of that proportionality. But in this particular case, what has been said, as far as we know, is that this attack contributed moderately to the overall aims of this war, or in that particular district. So there was a moderate benefit or moderate advantage to what we aimed for. That is what we, and I say it from the top of my head, was written in American documents. So, but that it is a relevant question, of course. But yeah, if you're talking about 80 people killed, it's a difficult discussion. But that's definitely what the government will claim. This was important, and indeed, hadn't we done this, much more civilians would have been killed. I can predict what will be in there, and that's the discussion we will we'll enter into.
Thank you. There was one last question in the back of the room that we're going to handle, and then I'll let you out.
Yes. Hi. My question was to Lisbeth. I was curious how you found the victims you represent, or whether they found you, and how you mentally prepared them for the multi-year procedure they are facing, a procedure that they might lose, potentially.
I may have missed the last one. The first one is important. if you asked me how this case was different from other cases, it may have been the first case in which I felt we have to do something. We cannot, when the news broke, half October 2019, I read it, I was in a meeting and I read it and I was, wow, good Lord, this raises shame, this is immense and we have to do something. I talked to the journalist who brought the news, who did the research over the last years, and I said, put me in touch with these people, they need help. And that evoked a discussion on whether journalists can indeed put their sources in contact with lawyers. And I said, I raised this point because I find it extremely important in terms of how it's also a matter of assisting people over there, assisting victims, because they don't know how to find legal help and access to all kind of means that they need. Well, in fact, in the Indonesian cases, the time bars were put aside by the court because the court decided these people could never have reached the Dutch courts, wouldn't have been for Dutch NGOs and Dutch lawyers assisting them. So it's extremely important. At the end of the day, I said, well, you know, even you don't have to put them in touch with me, but if you just establish a contact with the Dutch bar, and they can make a decision for themselves if you feel that you would otherwise benefit, you know, help me with earning my money, I don't know. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, there was a journalist who did what she felt that should be done. But it's a fundamental discussion on the relationship between journalism and lawyerism, so to speak, and on how do we assist victims. And I do feel that our military behaves differently with people far away for the exact reason that they cannot reach anyone here. They do not speak the language, they do not have the money, they do not have the email, they don't even have a computer. So they're unable to undertake action until it's too late. Mm-hmm. So it's a sensitive and a difficult area we're in. I did recognize the journalists' questions here and their sense of responsibility for their own work and that they should be completely objective. And I said, well, listen, you're benefiting from these people for your own headlines. Why don't you do something in return by assisting them this way? Well, it's for me, it was crucial too. Mm-hmm. So that was the first time, because all these cases come to us through journalists, always.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm sorry, I know you have another question, but it's... Sorry, yes. Would like to respond to this last comment. I'm sorry, no, but I'm not going to allow that because that deserves a whole... Okay, if any of my speakers have to part, I... Wat zeg je?
Even nieuwsgierig, maar je zegt zo zijn naam wel.
Yes, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Kees Verstee, writing for NRC, who broke the news together with Ben Menensma, colleague of NOS here, sitting beside me. I remember the discussion very well with Ms. Lies Zegveld, and of course, I don't remember it exactly the way that she is describing it right now. What I felt at that particular moment was my responsibility, not for the victims, alas, I would say, not for the victims and the subjects of my story, but for my public. My public is even more important than the victims of this incredible attack, and of course this happening. Why is this public more important for me? Because my public expects from me that I respect in as objective way as possible, not objective, but objective as possible. That means that we take more sides of this story in account. Not only of the victims, but also the actors that play a role in this. For instance, the coalition, international coalition. for instance, the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and many other parties, also Misidentification as well. So when you say you are using the victims for your headlines, I say, no, they are a very important part of my story. Very important. They are one of the parties, of the important parties that persuaded me to write this story. But they are not the most important party. That's my public. I hope you understand. And maybe Ben wants to comment on this as well.
Drink a beer now. Together.
Ja, misschien in het Nederlands. Ik heb die discussie met Liesbeth ook gehad. Hè. Dat was toen een vraag die opkwam en daar hebben we het over gehad. Kijk, voor mij is het een hele fundamentele journalistieke kwestie inderdaad. Wat gaat over de lange termijn. Hè. We spelen allemaal onze eigen rol. Dus ik waardeer zeer het werk van zowel Liesbeth als natuurlijk van Pax. En het is belangrijk dat het gebeurt. Maar voor de lange termijn, dus ik denk voor de journalistieke geloofwaardigheid, is de distantie ten opzichte van je onderwerp, is denk ik belangrijk, zeg maar, als het gaat om de geloofwaardigheid naar ons publiek. Dus ik ben ontzettend blij natuurlijk dat slachtoffers een weg gevonden hebben en een manier hebben gevonden om in contact te komen met anderen. Maar de journalistieke rol voor ons op dat moment is niet die van bemiddelaar tussen advocaten en nabestaanden. Hoe cru en zuur het ook is. Nou, dan hebben we een soort van morele discussie.
Ja. Het is een fantastische discussie, denk ik. Maar echt niet voor vanavond. Voor een andere keer bij een ander programma. Dank u wel heel erg dat u hier was vanavond. Het rapport is terug te lezen online. Doe dat vooral. Dank... Oh, het is in de zaal. Sorry, u heeft het al. Neem het mee. Zeg tegen anderen dat ze het online kunnen lezen. Dank aan de VPRO voor de fragmenten. En ik wens u een hele fijne avond. Dank u wel.